Alright, watching every Ghibli movie, episode 14. I just watched Howl's Moving Castle. This one's from 2004, and let's get right into it. Also, spoiler warning. Now, we have finally arrived at the era of Ghibli movies that came out after I was born, which means that hopefully I'll start to have more personal anecdotes to share outside of what I liked and disliked about each film. And I certainly thought that this was going to be the case with Howl, but I was dead wrong. So for as long as I remember knowing about this movie, I always thought that the old woman on the poster was Howl, and so I contextualized Howl as a female name. As a result, it took me an embarrassingly long amount of time to realize that Howl is the tall blonde guy who can fly, so that just gives you an idea of how little I know about this movie. One notable thing about this film I thought was how it takes place entirely in a fantastical setting, almost completely removed from the real world, which is something pretty rare for Ghibli films. Most of the time the story will integrate the real world in with whatever magical element interests the movie, with a certain amount of contrast being drawn between them. In Howl though, I find it interesting that the aesthetic, which I'm gonna call living steampunk, seems to be pretty universal throughout the movie's setting. Although I should mention that I think I said something similar to this about Princess Mononoke, but a commenter informed me that that movie was actually supposed to take place during a real era in Japan. So maybe something similar is going on here in Howl's Moving Castle. I don't know. Either way, I still think the film's expression of its setting was pretty impressive. I say this because as someone who watches a lot of fantasy shows, especially those which start off in the real world and bring the protagonist or protagonists into the fantasy world, I am very used to seeing characters whose main purpose is being the audience surrogate. Obviously, a character being an audience surrogate is not inherently a bad thing, but they are quite the convenient vector to justify lazy exposition dumps. Point being that Howl's Moving Castle comes across as noticeably more confident in its storytelling than most fantasies I've seen. Basically, I never felt like the movie was spoon-feeding me information, and although I did like this about Howl, I will say that it did occasionally make the story a bit hard to follow for me, and I'll admit this may be in part due to my previously mentioned misconceptions about the movie going in. For example, at the very beginning of the movie, when all the women are weirdly excitedly talking about seeing Howl's castle in the distance and about how Howl ripped out some woman's heart, because I thought Howl was an old woman, I was very confused about what Howl did to become so well known amongst the town folk. In hindsight though, that was obviously meant to be characterization for Howl as a charmer who steals women's hearts. But even in spite of stuff like that, where my ignorance was clearly caused by external factors, I was still confused about a few things in this movie. Like, I could not wrap my head around the whole war plot. Like, I'm still confused as to why the kingdom that Sophie is from was at war with the next kingdom over. And like, the turnip scarecrow turns out to have been the king of that kingdom, and once he becomes human again, Sophie's queen is just like, well, that was fun. I guess we don't need to be at war anymore. I feel like I must be missing something here. For the most part though, I felt like the movie's lack of exposition actually made me think less about the elements of its narrative that I didn't understand all that well. For example, I have no idea what the logic was behind the sequence where Sophie sees Howl's past, but I didn't even stop and think about it until writing this portion of the script. So obviously this doesn't ruin the movie. Alright, now it's time for the obligatory section of these videos where I gush about how beautiful these films are. My eyes are children, and this movie is strangers on Halloween night. The world design that I described earlier as living steampunk is realized about as much as it could be in a film that is only tangentially about that technology. I know Howl's Castle is actually more magic than machinery, but the first time I saw it up close with all the different parts moving independently from one another, I was utterly blown away with not only the sheer detail on display, but also how clearly the movement of all of those parts communicated that this structure is alive. It's probably the single strongest element of this movie visually, but that's not to imply anything negative about the rest of the film. There is absolutely no shot in Howl's Moving Castle that I think looked anything less than great. Directing is stellar, animation is stellar, color composition, background art, editing, it's all just as impressive as the rest of the studio's works, and honestly, that's one of the things that has impressed me the most about this whole watching every Ghibli movie endeavor. Studio Ghibli's ability to make each film feel like it has something to build onto the last one visually honestly, even though the actual fundamentals of their animation reached a bit of a ceiling in terms of technical quality at around Princess Mononoke, from my perspective at least, is just baffling, and it makes me so happy that I decided to watch these movies in chronological order. Every time I finish a movie, I think, okay, now they've covered all the bases, and then the very next film will have some completely unique animation style or focus on one specific visual element that I never realized could be pushed this far. And of course, for Howl, this element would be the moving castle. Oh yeah, it was also the first Ghibli movie to finally give us some food porn. Obviously, I had seen this clip before because it's such an iconic example of anime food is perfect, but like, it's iconic for a reason. Just look at it. Like, I don't even have anything else to say about it. I just want to fill out time here so that I can keep this perfect loop playing for as long as possible. Okay, I should move on. While I wasn't as able to follow the plot of this movie as well for whatever reason, I still found the central messages of it enjoyable and valuable. War is one of the worst things imaginable to me, so I like that Howl takes a very firm stance against the conflict between the two nations. But what I found even more resonant as a theme, however, was the idea that having a heart is both wonderful and freeing, but also a burden and a weight on the individual. Feeling love for someone requires that you open up and make yourself vulnerable, as well as put trust in that other person to treat you well. It reminded me a bit of the hedgehog dilemma proposed in Neon Genesis Evangelion. The idea being that two hedgehogs, or porcupines, I don't remember which, can try to cuddle up with one another to share body heat during the winter, but the closer they get, the more they prick each other with their spines. This obviously being a metaphor for human relationships. We all desire to become close with one another, but doing so can put us through extremely painful experiences that are unavoidable. And this movie takes the stance that having a heart is worth all of that baggage, that the benefits outweigh the downsides, which I agree with, and it's just a wholesome message and I like it, okay? There doesn't need to be a deeper analytical meaning. A slightly less apparent message that I noticed was in the character the Witch of the Waste, specifically in how once her magic is drained away, she becomes relegated to something of a comic relief role. Though I don't think comic relief perfectly describes how she fits into the cast, the point is that she isn't taken very seriously as a character with much agency over the plot. However, she is the one who is primarily responsible for the near death of Calcifer and Howl when her lust after Howl's heart compels her to pull Calcifer out of the fireplace. For a little while, it felt like she had kind of been pardoned for all of her sins once her powers get taken away. So for her to effectively kickstart the final act of the film in a way that made perfect sense for that character felt very holistic. It's that feeling when you think a movie has forgotten about one element and then it pulls it back up and goes, no, I haven't forgotten about it, and then you're like, yay. I'm keeping it. I loved everything to do with Howl's transformation into a monster and how that relates to his emotional state, because I've always had something of a fixation on ways of clearly communicating people's emotions without dialogue. A recent example of this that comes to mind is the numbers from the show Infinity Train. In that show, the characters each get numbers on their hands that reflect the severity of their emotional issues by going down when the character makes a breakthrough of some sort, or up when they fall deeper into a hole that they find themselves in. Also, since I'm on the subject, I'm going to shamelessly plug my Infinity Train AMV. I don't care if you're annoyed that I'm breaking up the flow of this video to mention it. I spent too much time on it to not promote it at every possible opportunity, and your life will be better after watching it. It's amazing. Card in the corner. Anyway, Howl turning into a giant bird beast, or his hair changing color, or his skin secreting green slime are all ways in which this movie puts you into Howl's head. And speaking from personal experience, I know the exact emotions that are invoked by these visuals to a T. Despite all the praise I have to give to Howl's Moving Castle, I can't say I thought it was spectacular. Although it does have so many positive values, I didn't feel like there was much connective tissue between those elements to make the whole package feel cohesive, which is why my thoughts about it are as scattered as they are. I'll definitely admit that I found myself struggling to pay attention at points, and so I may have missed some important details. However, I'd still put Howl in the good but not quite great tier, which I'm a little sad about because it is incredibly popular and beloved. I remember someone saying that they were excited to hear me talk about it because this is their personal favorite Ghibli film, but I guess sometimes that's just the way the cookie crumbles. Anyway, I'd give it a solid 7 out of 10. But what do you think about Howl's Moving Castle? Where does it rank on your list of Ghibli favorites? And also, what films are you most excited for me to get to in this series? Next up, I'm going to be watching Ged Senki, or Tales from Earthsea, so I hope you'll tune in for that. But until then, I hope you have a wonderful day, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.